Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, President Trump is vowing to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. What would that mean for students and staff here in Michigan? Plus, how are students measuring up academically since COVID? Why are so many students missing class with chronic absenteeism on the rise? And how can we help those students impacted by poverty? We have two experts who work on the front lines of these important education issues with us tonight. But first, we'd like to hear from you to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media. On Facebook, you can email us. You can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows this season, you can log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Our guest tonight in studio, Molly Macek, Director of Education Policy with the Mackinac Center of Public Policy. Has been here a time or two. We're glad to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
And joining us live remote, Dr. Robert Livernois. He's a retired school district superintendent from the Warren Consolidated Schools, been there about 20 years, has had an education career spanning 36 to 40 years. And he's also a consultant with the Michigan Leadership Institute. He teaches school at Wayne State, so you wear many hats on education. So nice to see you today.
Great to be here.
So let's start with the Trump administration vowing to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. What do you make of that? What impact would it have here in our state? Dr. Livernois, I'll give you first dibs on that.
Thanks. You know, I think one thing from an education perspective we need to focus on is what is the reality on the ground as it relates to the functions of the department versus a lot of the political rhetoric that you see in the media. And I'm sure, as you know, the Department of Education has a number of responsibilities, the first of which is, and I know this has been a big debate, is the department was authorized by Congress, and the actual elimination of it certainly would require congressional approval. And within that, and this is something I experienced for a long time as superintendent, there are a number of current laws on the books that the department is responsible for managing, from the civil rights enforcement to the Every Student Succeed Act, and before that the Elementary and Secondary Education Acts, the Higher Education Act, students with disabilities, and so on and so on. So when you move away from just how red hot the political rhetoric is, there are a lot of mechanics at work to the concept of just dismantling it. And I think the future of it is to be written, just given the implications of those things that I've highlighted.
That's a good point. Molly, I don't know if you can expand on that or even talk a little bit about, can any of you explain how K-12 funding works, and if a change at the federal level would change that process at all?
Yeah, and I'll build on a bit what Robert was saying, but like he said, you know, the mechanics of how those programs, how that would change, it's kind of still uncertain. But the fact of the matter is that the Department of Education was created by statute, so its elimination would require an act of Congress, and also those programs it's responsible for administering, and the funding that is allocated for those programs would also require federal legislation to change. So at this point, it seems that that funding would still be available. It's possible it would be administered differently, possibly through, we've heard about possibly through the Department of Health and Human Services, the Title I funding, which provides funding for students of poverty. So that would be one possibility. Department of Justice, potentially, for special education needs. So the funding would still be there. The mechanics of what that might look like, that's yet to be determined. But Michigan receives, it's about 10% of its funding from the federal government. The remaining 90% comes from primarily state and local sources. So of course, that remains intact, and so moving forward, regardless of what happens with the federal funds, we need to make sure that those state funds, that we continue to allocate those towards initiatives that are really able to improve outcomes as efficiently as possible.
Sure. A lot more debate on that to be had, that's for sure. Dialing down here into Michigan, Governor Whitmer, in her State of the State address in February, said, quote, "We spend more and we get less," referring to education, end quote. She also said Michigan spends more on schools than most states on a per pupil basis, but gets worse results. We do have a graphic here, and maybe both of you can sort of weigh in on what she said, and we talk about the current status of education here in Michigan. K-12 spending and student achievement from 2013 to 2024. Recent results in the National Assessment of Educational Progress is really sobering, to say the least. Reading and math scores, 4th and 8th graders aren't good. Graduation rates aren't good either. So, Molly, since that's sort of your graft, why don't you talk a little bit about that? And I'm sure Dr. Livernois can weigh in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what we're seeing here is, this goes back to 2013, so a little over 10 years, the dramatic increase in spending by the state on education. And we're also seeing the decline, more stagnant scores for a while, for many years in reading and math, and the more recent, more drastic decline in those scores. And these scores are from the NAEP assessment, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So it's a nationally administered exam. And we particularly saw a decline around COVID and after the pandemic era school lockdowns. And so as we can see, despite the increase in spending, the achievement has been on the decline, which is very concerning.
So Robert, have you had a chance to see that graph? And you've been at this a long time. What do you see happening?
Well, I have a question for Molly first that might help frame my answer. The red line that indicates the increase in spending, that you indicated that's from MDE. Do you know whether that reflects around 2020 that influx of money from the pandemic funding?
That I do not believe it includes that. So that's the state spending over those
well,
years.
the pandemic funding did come through the state. That's why I ask, because if that red line, which shows a dramatic increase, includes that pandemic funding, you had 3 different versions of ESSER's money from the federal government. The first one actually came from President Trump before he left office the first time. The subsequent 2 from President Biden. The reason I make that point is it really is indicative of the state's position we're in as it relates to the constant flux in education expectations. And as a superintendent for 20 years, I can tell you that nearly every year or 2, there has been some new law passed or expectation passed, all in an effort to improve or reform education. And I have seen a boatload of abject failures where things come in, they stay for a while, they go back. And that's why I'm just curious as to the money that shows that red line. That's a really important feature because every time there's a change in the political structure of the legislature, everything changes. And Molly, I'm sure you could appreciate, I'm not sure where you were working when Governor Snyder started and they went hard to the right and dismantled all of the union-friendly legislation. Then when Governor Whitmer got in, the pendulum swung back the other way. And the implications of all of that movement just creates an incredible amount of instability in schools that is really complicated by the fact that poverty in Michigan is off the charts. It is off the charts. I'll just say one thing that relates to this because I think it's important. Traditionally, poverty is measured by students who claim a free or reduced lunch. And just a few weeks ago, the MLive published a study by the Michigan United Way that showed the actual number for children who are living below a standard. They call it ALICE, your affordable housing, et cetera, is something close to 44% of all school children are living below an affordability situation. And I'm sure you know, being a researcher, the correlations between socioeconomics and student achievement are strongly correlated. So that's why I was curious as to how the red line was comprised, just given there's no doubt schools received a ton of money, but in the mix of that, the crushing effects of poverty are really devastating a state that is caught in this political dynamic where it's impossible for people to row in the same direction.
Sure, if I could add a little bit to that. So absolutely, poverty certainly has an effect. And the Mackinac Center is actually, in just another week or so, releasing a report. It's called the Context and Performance Report Card, which they used to release it several years ago. The last one was released in 2019. But it uses a statistical analysis, a formula applied to student or school test scores over, this one will be over a period of 3 years, and it actually then adjusts their performance for poverty. So, and then it assigns a letter grade based on the score that is produced through that calculation. So it's a really great indicator. A lot of schools appreciate it, the fact that it is adjusted for poverty levels, so that we can see how schools performed, keeping in mind the socioeconomic makeup of the student population. So whereas, so some schools actually, you can see, are performing much better than what you would have predicted based on their poverty level. So just be on the lookout for that.
In my time, one of the things we found helpful in school improvement is there used to be a term called beating the odds schools. And that was where you could find schools who are doing better than you with similar demographics. And that always provided schools an opportunity to find out and learn, well, what are you doing that's helping you beat the odds as opposed to everyone else? And that's probably one of the most helpful things that we had at our disposal to try to make the right decisions. And I do want to mention one thing about the National Assessment of Educational Progress, because I think this is a really important point, and I'm not sure how it's adjusted statistically. But in Michigan, when a student takes the M-STEP, it is an adaptive assessment based on a question-by-question approach. So, for example, a student gets a question correct, the program automatically asks it another question that might be slightly more difficult. If the student gets it wrong, then the assessment gives it another type of question, whereas the NAEP does that on a section-by-section basis. And I don't know that those results for NAEP truly reflect what's happening in Michigan, especially given the merit curriculum we're all following really doesn't connect very well with that assessment. So just for what that's worth.
Well, something sort of that might be connected to poverty, and I'm going to kind of segue and hold with me here, because chronic absenteeism is happening in bigger numbers and families struggling overall with poverty-related issues possibly. So is there a correlation to students just simply aren't going to class? And can we make the point that maybe some of them are also struggling with poverty-related issues? We do have a graph on the chronic absenteeism, so why don't we go to that? You can walk through that, and I'll have Robert look at that as well. So here's the graph on chronic absenteeism, Motley.
So, yeah. So this is showing obviously the since 2016 how chronic absenteeism has increased greatly, especially again during the pandemic. So we think there are certainly many factors that can contribute to chronic absenteeism. Right. But Robert could probably shed some more light on this based on his experience in the field. But actually, at this time, I was an administrator at a high school, and we certainly saw mental health issues playing a role in this. I know that in Detroit, for example, and other urban areas, maybe rural areas, transportation can become a factor. Right. So a lot of factors play into this. Ideally, we would love to see policies adopted in Michigan that would allow students to be able to access more schools, more options. It's possible that their current assigned school or the closest school to their home is not the best fit for them. So there could be other factors playing into that's making it difficult for them to go to school. So providing them with greater access to other options could certainly be a solution, but I would love to hear Robert's perspective.
I couldn't agree with you more with some of the things you highlighted. One thing, when you look at this chart and you'll see that spike around 21 to 22 and it's sort of coming down, I really think, in addition to all that you mentioned, we currently have we have some societal apathy about people actually wanting to go into the office. And when the pandemic had everyone working from home, lots of people got good at it, and many of them resisted the idea of coming back to the office. So I believe, at least in part, the effect of everyone being able to work from home, at the same time, schools truly becoming experts in online management through Schoology and other platforms, really has contributed to the apathy of why students don't want to go to school. And there is a substantial factor in that as it relates to school safety. When you have an Oxford happen right in the state of Michigan, I can tell you many, many families who are terrified to send their children to school. I know lots of preschool moms who are exploring homeschool options because they're just terrified to come to school. So if we had to create a triangle of data, we look at the typical factors of socioeconomic, we look at the apathy about people wanting to come into the office and go physically to work somewhere, and you combine that with the school violence that's happened right in our backyard, you have a pretty good recipe for people not wanting to come into school buildings above and beyond what you mentioned. So there's no doubt in my mind that those factors have played a substantial role in students' willingness to come to school.
So does Michigan, in your experience, need to be more innovative, expanding more sort of options, whether that's school choice, charter schools, vouchers, and as it relates to sort of families struggling with poverty issues, if you have a family that's in a failing school district, should they make more options for them to go across the street or a few miles away into a school district that's performing a little bit more? So I'll let either one of you kind of take that.
Sure.
Go ahead, Melanie.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, to answer your first question, yes, we need to be more innovative, and we need to look to other states, other models, successful schools in Michigan and in other states. What are they doing? And we are seeing this evolving education landscape in Michigan and across the country in response to the pandemic and what were parents and kids' experiences with the online learning and whatnot. So we are seeing a lot of innovation happening. More than 30 states now have some type of school choice policy in place that allows students to access these other types of approaches, more innovative approaches, just different models, allowing them to find a fit that really works better for them. But in Michigan, we are not able to implement quite as private school choice policies because of our Constitution, an amendment in our state Constitution. So absolutely, I think that is a priority to be able to bring more options to Michigan. By having some more competition, that tends to drive innovation and should help all schools to improve and as a result improve student opportunity and outcomes for them.
And, you know, in my experience with regard to choice in charter schools, as choice expanded, and at one point in time, there was a cap on the number of charter schools, which then soon after that cap was lifted. One thing that happened in Warren as a, sort of an inner ring suburb around Detroit is you had an explosion of racial intolerance as families from the city sought a better opportunity for their children. And it's kind of one of those things that nobody likes to talk about. And what's interesting about the charter and choice rules is when they were enacted, it allowed districts, and I believe it's still this way, it allowed districts to decide whether they were going to accept students on choice. You can even do it by grade level, et cetera, et cetera. And that further created the culture of haves and have-nots. For example, there are many wealthier communities around Detroit that don't allow students in on schools of choice, whereas others do, either for financial necessity or whatnot. And what my experience has been, at least in this area, and I'm very much aware there are some successful charter schools in operation, but what's happened in and around Detroit is charter schools, in many cases, open up, they're privately chartered, and then after a couple of years, they go out of business, and those students are then returned to the public school. And indirectly, it creates more transiency in their lives. And in my district, when I left, I can assure you that the greater majority of our students, by the time they get to high school, have been in 3, 4, maybe even 5 different school systems for one reason or another. Whether it's homelessness, whether they're moving in with grandma because they don't have any money, whether they were in a charter school. So the whole notion of competition to improve schools certainly makes sense. The challenge becomes when you allow the haves and the have-nots to continue to sort of guard their turf, it really actually leaves more children behind, which is exactly what happened to the city of Detroit when all of the churches and private enterprises came in and opened up schools. It literally bankrupted the school district at a rate that I don't think they could have kept up with. So that is a complicating issue. And on a lighter note, I remember being a high school teacher in 1995, and some guy came to us from North Central, and he said, you know, schools of choice are coming. And all the old time teachers are like, no way, right? They were just in total denial. And if they were still here today, they would see firsthand the shift in that.
And Molly, I know on your website at mackinac.org, you've written an article, kind of Michigan as a conflicted view on school choice. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, it's interesting in that, you know, from K through 12, we don't have private school choice. We have public school, schools of choice, which is a public open enrollment program, but private school choice is prohibited because of an amendment in our state constitution. But the state does support, and the governor, has supported providing scholarships for students in pre-K and post-secondary school, so for private and public universities in the state of Michigan. So it's interesting that we are limited in being able to provide private school choice during the most critical learning years from K to 12, and yet and the state is open to providing state funding for private programs, both pre-K and post-secondary. So I think we really need to reconsider how we are allocating our funds and be more open to also supporting choice within those K through 12 years.
So Robert, looking at your crystal ball with your experience, as you look ahead, do you think that law is going to change? Do you think our legislature, our state leaders will ever change that in the not too distant
My nearly
future?
40 years in education tells me that Michigan is a continual pendulum, and whoever has the power and the money promote their causes. And then when that shifts, the other group comes in. You just saw it in the last 10 years. And I think, and when you consider how much Michigan was a swing state in the presidential election, we really are, in many respects, the bellwether for the country as it relates to what I like to call just the destructive forces of partisanship that prohibit everyone to come together. You know, former state superintendent Brian Whiston, God rest his soul, passed away. He attempted, when he was state superintendent, to create a top 10 and 10 plan that would actually get everyone rowing in the same direction. And unfortunately, in our state, you have a state board of education that is elected by the people separately, the legislature is. So you really create these pockets of power that, as dark as this sounds, I really don't see a path forward that would be good for all children because of the polarity in our state. You see it in every walk of life, and it really puts the schools in the middle, whether they're charter, traditional, public schools or whatnot. It puts them in the middle because each time, as I said, a group comes in and they create a whole bunch of new laws, the schools, it's like turning a freighter around in a canal, right?
Right.
You got to try and turn this whole ship around. Until we can take the partisanship out of it, I think we're destined for the same back and forth, and the only ones really harmed in it are the children.
Molly, in about 30 to 45 seconds, I think you brought something up about a federal tax credit scholarship. Does that fit into the conversation we're having here to end our show?
Well, there have been 2 bills introduced in Congress, one in the House and one in the Senate. It would be a federal tax credit scholarship. This would be a change to federal tax code that actually would be a way to bring private school choice to Michigan. The state constitution would not prohibit federal funds from being used for that purpose. So it would actually open the door to families being able to have expenses, all sorts of expenses covered in addition to tuition, so tutoring and therapies, and so that's in Congress right now.
About 30 seconds, Robert. Does that sort of make sense to you or not?
It certainly does. I think it will, if that opportunity presents itself here, I think it will just exacerbate the polarity that exists in the state, and it'll just become one more thing we have to contend with. And the tragic irony of this whole conversation is, just a couple of weeks ago, the Republican legislature introduced new curriculum for the state to consider.
Okay. I'll have to leave it at that. Dr. Robert Livernois, Molly Macek, thank you again. I'll have you on the after show segments. There'll be more for people to see on our web. And that's our show tonight. Be sure to join us again next week for the follow-up. How are the Trump tariffs affecting you? That's next week. We'll see you on Tuesday. Bye-bye. Well, welcome to the follow-up after show, kind of our web extra, the viewers that watch the big show that runs live at 8 o'clock on Tuesday nights. We don't have enough time to get into it all, but we can add to it and expand to it in our follow-up after show. Molly Macek, Director of Education Policy, Mackinac Center for Public Policy, was on the big show. She joins us on the after show, along with Dr. Robert Livernois, retired school district superintendent of the Warren Consolidated Schools, now a consultant at the Michigan Leadership Institute. And Dr. Robert, I'll just stay with you on the after show segment and talk about sort of the partisanship in the state and its impact on education and how it compares to sort of other states. So your turn.
Yeah, so I've been doing some reading, and I've learned that many of the swing states in the last federal election have similar battles over education that we do. And when you consider how Michigan performs on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, there are many states that are caught in a similar partisan trap that we are, that don't perform very well. There are outliers in certain areas or whatnot, but I think as we live through this current time politically, and now with the explosion of social media influencing opinion, not to mention you have an entire segment of our population using podcasting that doesn't have any rules or regulations primarily to message things that are of a particular nature. And in my experience, even before this most recent um, exacerbation politically, Michigan has been a pendulum, almost a wrecking ball of education policy. And I can go back to the middle 2000s when the assessment was the high school content expectations. Then they brought in the merit curriculum, and then they used the ACT for a while, and then they moved the SAT. And if you did a little bit of homework, it is staggering the amount of change in education policy that's happened in the last 15 years. And ironically, probably tragically, much of it is perceived as trying to help kids. But because of the partisanship that exists, there is no hope for it. And when you consider how the pendulum swung in Whitmer's administration from where it swung in Snyder's administration, there's no better example of it. And now, at least for a couple of years, we're in this gridlock where things are the pendulum has slowed down, but I can assure you that until the state can figure out how to take care of children in poverty and get the partisan politics to row in the same direction, I think we're in for more of the same. And I realize that it's not a very hopeful look for the future, but it is a real one based on my experience.
It is certainly sobering. I don't know if you can have a different take or a similar take on that, but that's sort of a heavy lift. If we can get away from this partisan politics, it would be great, right?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think with that shifting pendulum, as you put it, Robert, we've seen some laws repealed, soon after they were put in place, where there really wasn't a lot of time to fully implement them and measure their effectiveness on student outcomes. And one example of that is the read by grade 3 law. The retention provision was repealed in 2023. And it wasn't really fully implemented in a lot of districts where we couldn't really determine how that was impacting student outcomes, third and fourth grade reading outcomes. And another one would be teacher evaluations. They went through a lot of changes for several years, and again in 2023, those were dramatically changed, reducing the portion of the evaluation that's based on standardized test scores. In fact, they no longer have to be based on standardized test scores at all, and unions are now able to negotiate what the structure of the evaluation. So now school officials are having to kind of go back to the bargaining table, renegotiate these contracts, certain terms regarding evaluations and personnel policies, and after not having to bargain collectively with unions for many years over these. So they're having to shift gears quite often due to also the shifting political landscape.
So Robert, I could ask, go ahead.
Molly, to that end, what I appreciate about your comment was when you take very specific things like third grade reading or anything that's legislated, which is sort of an independent action from the State Board of Education. I often wonder if the State Board of Education could have control of the money for education and not let it fall to the legislature and it be a vote of the people, which it is. Would that somehow be a better representation of what the state needs and eliminate the legislature from creating things that schools have to follow? In my experience, there's something known as the golden rule, and that means he or she who has the gold rules. And that's what we're living with in Michigan. And the state board does a great job trying to promote policies and that really do good things through the Department of Ed, like mental health supports and that. And then you have the legislature sort of running a separate agenda, and it just creates and exacerbates that gridlock. And things have become so personal. When you consider the forces at work, and I'll say this, the next group that gets full control of the legislature and the governor's office, there will be a price to pay for whoever's on the other side, which is what we've experienced in the last 15 years. So I just want you to know I was far more positive when I was a superintendent, but I've interviewed over 200 people since August, all across the state, private schools and public schools, and they all tell me the same thing, that we're all just caught in this. And until the state can figure that out, I think we're in for, as I said, more of the same.
Molly, I'll let you have that last word on this.
Yeah, some interesting thoughts, and I don't know how things might be different. I know that there is legislation right now that's been introduced that would change how school board, the state school board members are elected. So that if that passes, that could look different and perhaps could change that dynamic. And it would be interesting to maybe explore further how your thoughts might play out with those changes.
Well, in the meantime, Dr. Livernois, you're in a great position as a consultant in the Michigan Leadership Institute. You also do a program on WJR in Detroit called School Talk, so keep talking about it. Molly, with the work you're doing at the Mackinac Center, continue to put those articles out. People need to get in tune to know what you're doing, and those of us here in the media, here at Delta Public Media, we're continuing to talk about these issues. They're important. You can lobby legislators, you can talk to people, but we need to keep talking about it because these are important, and any way you can make change. And we're putting up your websites there at the Michigan Leadership Institute, mackinac.org. If our viewers want to get more information, that's where you need to go. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. And thank you for joining us on the After Show.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.